Okay, thank you everybody for again coming out to another session of the House Committee on Finance. It's been a good day outside, a sunny day, and so we've got some fresh air and we're ready to go for the next 13 hours. So we will do our best to get the job done. But thank you again, in all honesty, for all that you do, especially the members of the Finance Committee. Tonight will be a little bit different. We do two things just so the public and the audiences can know. A lot of times we do just normal bills like every other committee does, and then we do the big bill, which is the state's budget, which has a lot of different parts to it. We're thankful to have some great co-chairs to run those that part of it. But this is what we're here to do. The 15 of us are here to begin the process of listening to briefings, getting an understanding of what's in the budget, what it looks like, how it was analyzed, so that we can then, put our own footprint and stamp on it. One of the things that we do in the House Committee on Finance is, by state statute or law, this is where the appropriation starts, so this is where the rubber meets the road. We will be seeing a lot of each other over the evenings and the nights as we go through this. But when we get to the articles, then that's very much like some of the bills we passed. However, we start off by having briefings given to us by our fiscal staff led by Sharon Ferland, who will do that tonight. These briefings are designed so that not just us, but our other members who might want to watch this now, or those who do look at them on tape, I'll go back and look at them too. It gives us an idea of what has been said, because it's a lot at first, and then it starts to come together after that. When Sharon finishes her briefing, if you have any questions on what she's briefed us on, that's the time to begin to ask those questions. And I know that even myself, I have to listen to one of these briefings and begin to formulate what I thought I knew or what I didn't know. So it's an educational experience. And I get a lot of emails from other people who do say that they get something out of what the briefings say rather than what's been written about them or said about them later. So this is where the rubber meets the road. As we do in the others, I would just ask you to let me know if you need to, because we do have people at home. Let me know if you have a question that you need to ask Sharon, and she will gladly do her best to make sure that you don't leave without having a good answer to your question or where she can find it. So, Mr. Clerk, if you would please call the roll.
Chairman Abney.
Present.
Vice Chair Slater.
Present.
Vice Chair Mazurkowski. Vice Chair, Representative Amore. Representative Baginski. Representative Barrows. Okay. Representative Barrows.
Present.
Representative Diaz. Representative Edwards.
Present.
Representative Hall. Representative Nadone. Representative O'Brien.
Here.
Representative Quattrucci.
Present.
Representative Ruggiero.
Present.
Representative Tabone. Representative Vella Wilkinson.
Here.
And Leader Filippi.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, appreciate your presence. So now we'll turn it over to Sharon, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As we typically do, following the submission of the governor's budget, the staff has gone through the documents and tried to present some of the highlights and lay out the path for your analysis in the coming months. And so what we're going to go over tonight is also an overview of the governor's budget, but we're also trying to layer in the sort of evolving federal relief situation. The newest package is not in the budget proposal. It was released on the same day the budget was due to you, so it's not reflected in there. But as you may have read or seen, it will have an enormous impact to state and local finances over the next several years. There are general and specific programs affecting pretty much every facet of the state and its citizens. So as I go through this presentation, I will try to comment where there's new money, semi-new money, things we know about, things we're still learning. This is a down payment on a work in progress. But again, we're happy to sort of direct our attention where there's a higher interest, but we are trying to, in addition to going through the budget, update these memos we've given you over the last year on federal support and what it means for your budget decisions as well as your constituents' interests. And so there's some of that in here because obviously that is incredibly on people's minds, but it is by no means a comprehensive review of that yet. Recently, very recently, the prior assembly adopted a budget, shortly after which the fifth stimulus package was signed into law. And as the fiscal year has gone on, you've seen the results of Q2 estimates from agencies and the budget office, updated closing information, and now the governor's budget. That came to you in two budgets, which has been the norm the last couple of years. So a standalone supplemental act with just one extra budget article that we'll talk about. And obviously have a hearing on, but then the FY22 Appropriations Act, which is clearly the larger of the two bills. That's this item here, about 400 pages, 17 or so articles. So we're going to touch upon the contents of both of those items, as well as I said, what's not here. So we're probably starting next Tuesday. You'll have some article hearings scheduled. So jumping right in, as it is the end of March, and it's not typical for you to start your budget review this late. It has happened before, but it's not typical. Obviously, there's nothing really typical going on here. We have provided to you interim analyses, a small one right after the budget came out, a more extensive one Tuesday with some extra special reports on local aid and revenues and a couple other items. We will, as we always do, publish another version of that with more reports, and then finally get you the larger comprehensive review, agency by agency, item by item. We are trying to intersperse in that as we can places where there's potential new federal funds not here, so that you're able to look at these things in context, because that clearly is not, was not available information at the time this was put together and submitted to you. And just around the corner, we'll be doing revenue and caseload estimating in just less than 2 months. So, as you know, veteran and newer members, that we usually start with a budget overview, and then you have your article hearings. As I mentioned, we are starting late. Those will probably take through April to get through. Combined, all these articles come to close, all these two bills get you up close to 20 separate articles. As you know, we'll also try and combine like items. The subcommittees will also have to do their work. That will usually starts a little bit after the article review is well underway. And then typically you may need to review any amendments requested by the governor and any other issues of interest. I guess we would say this federal stimulus funds certainly falls under that issue of interest, and we'll need to continue to bring you updated information and things you need to know to incorporate items and priorities into budgets and other decisions. As always, our materials are available on the General Assembly's website. You may have noticed last session we reorganized it a little bit to make the more frequent information easier to access, but we're always able to help anyone find information that they can't find, because obviously the people who put it together can navigate it the easiest, but we're happy to help people find things they need. So the presentation is going to follow a typical format in that we'll review just sort of the prior year, the current year, and the budget year, how the governor solved the then known budget gap, and look at some of the items in the operating and capital budget. And interspersed in all of this is a look at how the federal stimulus plays into it, because it can't be done separately. It is embedded in all of these items in some form or another as a solution or a potential new issue to resolve. So the books closed for 2020 with an extra $154 million. We had a hearing on this, so I won't dwell on these tables except to remind you that at the end of the day, the closing, because it covered a couple of years' issues with some interesting FEMA reimbursement treatment, ultimately, as we looked at these changes over a 2-year period, there were a couple of big items that didn't really impact the bottom line, but some smaller items that did. And overall, you picked up about $16 million towards a future deficit solution. So these are things we reviewed last time, but they're just here for your reference. Looking at the 21 revised budget and the fiscal 22 deficit estimate, I'm kind of going to go over these in concert with each other because the budget was adopted so close to when you had your second quarter hearing, and the decisions you'll see in the revised budget really speak to the resolution of the 22 budget gap. As we talked about at the end of February, the Budget Office had been projecting an extra $31.5 million. That's without knowing what the audited closing said. So that really brought up closer to almost $50 million of net gain. And at the time, we knew that the state would benefit from some additional Medicaid match for an extended period of time. We also knew that there were other changes that we had not put a dollar amount on and factored into a deficit estimate. So we came to you and said, we know the deficit could be around 330, but there's several unknowns that are going to make that number higher, lower, who knows. So that number got reported, and so I like to always try and get back to somewhere close to what we had talked about. So I will talk you through some of these unknowns at the time and how they're factored in. So what we did know is, of course, that the current year showed a significant surplus. And the governor's budget before you increases that current year surplus essentially as part of a 2-year solution to the fiscal 22 deficit. There's newly available federal funds to be used. There's a change to the schedule on paying back the RICAP fund for the prior use of the rainy day fund. And there's a response to some federal tax law changes. Okay. And so these 3 years we just talked about, the governor's budget has it ending with a small surplus in 22, but if you look at that middle data column, FY21, you can see that the governor's budget resolution has a $265 million surplus in the current year, which is how you solve 22 by pushing that forward. So as I talk about these solutions, they're really going to be the 2-year solutions. It's not a perfect way to do it because there's things that don't always lend themselves to a 2-year discussion, but just for big picture reasons, we're going to talk about it this way in this forum. So the governor's budget solution, we tried to put them in similar categories we've done for you before. And you can see there's a revenue component, something affecting human service agencies, local aid, commerce, all the same things. The biggest item is the cost shifting, and that's that combination of moving when RICAP gets paid back, using freed up federal funds through a number of measures. Those two things alone get you that big push of extra funds. And then there's dozens and dozens of other changes which we'll highlight for you, but our books kind of go items of interest as well as article explanations, but we're just going to pick off a few things that may interest you. Looking at the revenue side, this is an item for reasons you'll see as I go through it, that actually the revenues are a drag on the budget solution, if you will. What we told you back in February was there was an issue with federal tax law change that would negatively impact our revenue estimates. And so that's because that all factors into the deficit, it ends up, the solution ends up as a negative to that. but it could have been worse. So on the revenue side, it's a net $51 million less than we had been projecting in our current service estimate. So the biggest component of that is changes to the treatment of forgiven loans from the Paycheck Protection Program. Other items that I'm not even going to talk about in all that much detail is an adjustment to the lottery estimate having to do with the pause in the current year. Adult use marijuana would contribute. There's a whole proposal, and we don't go into it here. We've got the article explanation in our book. But the net general revenue impact to the state on that item for fiscal 21 is projected to be $1.7 million. There's some enhanced collections. A number of fees are increased. There's one scoop, if you will, one transfer from the underground storage tank fund and a couple of other minor adjustments. I'm happy to answer questions on those. In the case where things were a revenue that's being paid for by a new expense, we're not, listing that as a plus and a minus because they net out for your purposes. But all those items are described in our publications, and you're going to have a hearing on all of them. But let me talk a little about the paycheck protection item. As you know, the CARES Act, so now a year ago, established the program, no-cost unsecured loans that could be forgiven under certain circumstances, and in most cases they were forgiven. And in that legislation, it said that those forgiven loans would not be considered income for federal tax purposes. So 9 months later, the Consolidated Appropriations Act passes. You had just passed your budget, and in there was a measure that said, in addition to not taxing the forgiven loans, you could still deduct all the expenses you paid for with them. Typical tax treatment of forgiven loans is if your loan is forgiven, you can't do the deductions because this not on the scale is unusual, but that's the way they're normally treated. So the Congress clarified that what they really wanted was not just the loans forgiven to be not taxable, but any expense paid for them could all still be deductible against other income. So this change in tax treatment was not known at the time the revenues were estimated in November, nor when you adopted your budget in December. So as we look at what is the new deficit, Office of Revenue Analysis did their best with the information they had to determine that it looked like this could result in about $133.3 million loss in revenues against the estimate to the state over 2 years. And it's in income, personal and business income taxes. So what the governor's budget does, and this is Article 2 in the supplemental because it's more time sensitive, the governor proposes to partially decouple the state from the federal treatment of this. The thing to know is that the state's treatment of items is similar to the federal government, but not always the same. We may have provisions that add things back, but you look at where we start on what the starting point of a federal return versus a state return, and it differs depending on the item. But in this case, we would have followed the definitions that the federal government has. So the state could allow for the treatment to go through on the deductions as well as the loan forgiveness, and realize the revenue losses that would go with it against the prior estimates. It could just decouple from the deductions. It could decouple from the income and the deductions. What the governor proposed is to say only the forgiven loans under $150,000 would be exempt from taxation. So if you got a loan above that, a forgiven loan above that amount, that would be subject to tax. There's no proposal around deductibility of expenses. This was a simpler solution to try and recapture some of that potential loss. So we'll have an article hearing on that, but I'm trying to explain why this looks like a negative, because essentially you're recognizing a potential loss and then clawing back about half of it in the budget. So on the enhanced collections, in a lot of places there's a revenue and an expenditure item. In the case of one of these items, the collections unit which was a pilot program and set to sunset, is being proposed to be extended. expected to collect 1.4 million, but costs about 800,000 to run. And then a new proposal on workplace tax compliance is expected to generate about $500,000, but you'd have to spend about 170,000 to hire staff to get that. So I'm happy to answer other questions on the revenue items, but those are kind of some of the items of interest that I didn't already mention.
I've got a question, Sharon. On the decoupling issue, is that something that we will, do we have to have a bill for that? Is that already built in, or is that an executive decision to decouple, in the sense of up to 150, lower than 150? Have we done that before here, ever?
So in the past, the state has passed legislation to decouple from things after the federal government has done something. And Governor McKee's supplemental budget 6121 has Article 2 that proposes the legislation needed to decouple. You
So this is
cannot
something
do
we-
it
yeah.
administratively, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, the
something we
proposal
have to
you're going to
pass.
be hearing this month, next month, it's late in the month, I can't even say this month, but is a change to the law.
Okay,
Because under current law, you are coupled for this item.
correct. Leader Felipe. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually interested in the PPP decoupling as well. So are we essentially saying that a portion of that PPP loan will be counted as income to the business?
Yes, that's the proposal.
Understand. And now those monies, in order to be forgiven, they would have to have been paid out for certain purposes. I'm correct under the PPP provisions. They would have to be either for rent or utilities or payroll.
Yes, we're only talking about forgiven loans when we say loans, so just in case I forget to say forgiven loan every time.
Yeah, turned into a
But only
grant.
the forgiven loans.
Gotcha.
Once it becomes a grant, and absent this CARES Act provision that said it's not income, under all other circumstances that would be income, right? Under the previous federal law, this is always treated as income to a business or.
Yeah.
Okay, so the federal law said, for this case, in this case only, it's not income.
Let me ask you this question. When the PPP funds were applied for and obtained, what was the current federal law? Did non-taxability of the grant only come into play with the law that was passed in Congress in December, or the whole time that the PPP loans were taken, it was assumed that they were non-taxable?
So it's two parts.
Please.
When it was passed in March, the income was always exempt if the loan was forgiven because it was in the original CARES Act legislation. Also, the IRS said, and one of their rulings was, the same rules apply when it comes to deductibility. The expenses paid for could not be deductible. So in December, Congress said, but we want it to be, and so we changed the law to make it that way.
Gotcha.
So the treatment on both sides of the equation, one is consistent on the federal side all the way through. It was always going to be forgiven income, a departure from how things normally happen. And then in December, the expenditure side became deductible where it wouldn't ordinarily be and was not provided for in any prior law.
So the expectation of business owners in this state when they obtained the PPP loan was that there would be a taxability, whether through the non-deductibility of the expenses, essentially the non-deductibility of the expenses
And so
was built into the law when the loans were obtained.
Yes.
And
Yes,
then,
absolutely.
So essentially then in December, Congress decided to grant another benefit to people by saying you can now deduct those expenses from your income.
Retroactively. yes.
Retroactively. And that's what Rhode Island is trying to essentially say. We're not going to do that retroactive. It was your expectation when you got the loan that your expenses weren't deductible. We're not going to piggyback on to your net income in this regard.
So I think what this proposal is saying is you knew something was going to be taxable. The easiest way to recapture that is to go on the income side, not the deductibility side.
Yeah, gotcha.
See what I'm saying?
Understand.
So yes, it is that there was a component for which you would have a tax implication. But in the case of the proposed solution here, the simpler way is to treat the income as taxable rather than the deductibility. So yes,
And so to be clear, it's only for loans that were converted into grants.
forgiven loans only, correct.
Forgiven loans
Yep.
only. Okay. All right, I understand. Thank you very much.
And we'll have more for you on your article hearing about the number of affected taxpayers in the proposal and all of that.
I mean, it's just for the committee, if I may, Mr. Chairman, on those loans, you had to certify that without the loans, you would suffer imminent harm. On the forgiveness application, you have to certify that you would have suffered imminent financial harm. It's just tough for me to hit Rhode Island businesses that were struggling. Maybe they wouldn't have taken the loan and wouldn't have kept people employed if they knew there'd be some taxes on the back end. I understand the argument that there was an expectation that state taxes might be due when they took the loan, but if Congress was given an extra benefit, it's hard for me to hit Rhode Islanders with those taxes, especially when we have all this extra money coming in.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Okay, Whip Edwards and then Vice Chair Slater.
Thank you, Chairman. Two really quick questions. The first is this change in the law, Sharon, is that a one-time fix for just for the PPP?
PPP and anything that looks like that in the future.
So it's not a one-time fix?
Right, yes, I mean, it's very limited, because remember that there was also in all of this an extension of the PPP loan program. You have the argument around loans that were already given. In December, more were made available with this provision. So there's kind of two big pieces.
And the second part of that is, have any other states started looking at handling these loans and taxing these loans the same way, or is it just too soon to know what any other states are doing currently?
So I don't have them off the top of my head. It's not too soon to know, because that discussion, when we met back in February and I raised this issue, we had started to hear from the administration, had talked to fellow tax offices, and we've heard what other states, some have decoupled, some haven't. For some, it is not an issue because they have an entirely different scheme that doesn't get affected by federal changes. So it always depends on the degree to which you have a conformance with federal definitions on things. So, there's a universe of states that have a similar impact with Rhode Island. Some of them are addressing it differently, some are not addressing it at all. We will have some updated information for you when we have the hearing on the item.
Thank you, Chairman.
Good. Vice Chair Slater and then back to Leader Felipe.
Sharon, thank you. Just a quick question along the same lines as with the decoupling, but in the first stimulus that we received, there was a bit of a lag time as far as the guidelines around it that were waited for a long time. So have all the guidelines been set for this, or could this come back to us later? Could the federal government come back and say that this money that we're getting is conditional on having these provisions to not do something like decoupling?
This is,
Do you understand?
I know exactly what you're saying. I think there's a lag in guidance issuance on programs when you're spending money. On things that are a little more straightforward, like a federal tax change, sometimes that is known right away and it's clear. Am I aware of any prohibition on state tax laws changing? No, because other states are doing any number of different things. So
I know we waited for a little while on our guidelines as far as how we could spend the original money for, so I wasn't sure if those were all set yet.
absolutely, yeah. No, those are not even close to all set. But I
Yeah.
think sometimes there are federal law changes that are black and white and not 100% subject to guidance issuance, like a federal tax law change that says you get this credit or you get this thing is deductible, different from here's a pot of money for a purpose, now the department in charge of it has to tell you what the right way to use it is.
And then one other question that kind of along the lines of this is the unemployment that the federal government had changed the way we treat them. They made a rule for the first 10,000, I want to say 200, would be exempted from your federal taxes. Is that treated the same way?
So the federal law change applies to tax year 2020 only.
Yeah.
So retroactive for the tax year that's over, 10,200. The state law, in fact, it was adopted back in '09 when this happened to you before, has a provision as an add back. If the federal government has any component of unemployment, it goes back into your AGI, so it wouldn't apply. There's no current state law that deducts that.
Okay,
So that-
so folks will be taxed on that first 10,000?
Yes, and that's been the expectation
Yeah.
all along. This was another kind of retroactive change.
Yeah, okay,
And only applicable to 2020, so.
all right, thank you.
Thank you. Let me get, I see Vice Chair Amore is asking a question online. Let me get to him. Okay, you're on, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I don't mean to interrupt Leader Filippi, but I'd like to be marked present, and I would point out that because I agree with Leader Filippi's analysis here, I would point out that Governor McKee has indicated that he intends to pull back on the decoupling idea, and that was put in the budget prior to the finalization of the latest stimulus. So, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Sharon, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, Leader Philippi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Amore. Although Governor McKee may pull back, he's dangled a piece of fruit in front of the General Assembly, which I think we need to realize it may be from the poisonous tree. So let me dig in a little bit more on PPP2. So when we spoke a couple minutes ago, and I thank Representative Edwards, Floor Manager Edwards, for sparking my memory on this, I didn't think it was objectionable to tax PPP1 that was taken last March, because when those loans were taken, under federal law, there was an expectation that you wouldn't be able to deduct the expenses, that there'd be some income on the backside, right? There'd be some recognition of income. And we kind of went through that. PPP2, which started in January, under federal law at that time, there was an expectation that you would have your net income, you wouldn't be recognizing PPP2 as income, and you would be able to deduct the expenses. And there was that expectation under federal and state law when those loans were taken. Is my analysis off on that?
I guess that is one way to look at it. And I guess all I would say to you is that this is not the first time you've had to react to the federal government changing rules that affect your rules retroactively. And since you didn't get a chance to figure out if you had the money to pay for certain changes, that's always an option for a state to decouple.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are a number of viewpoints on what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. I don't have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I understand. Your numbers, we're policy. So it's a policy, Mr. Chairman, is that with PPP1, I understand the idea that it could be taxable by the state, because when the loans were obtained, it was assumed that there was a tax consequence to those loans. When PPP2 came about in January, under state and federal law, there was an expectation that there would be no tax consequences. So I'm concerned about drafting this in law where Representative Edwards, Floor Manager Edwards, elicited that, yes, this is for future programs too. So next year, when people are doing their taxes for 2021, they're going to be taxed on PPP2, which was just obtained. They're going to be taxed on it, but under law, state and federal, when they obtained that loan, it was non-taxable. So I just don't want to change the rules after. So PPP1, it's not a problem. I think PPP2, we're going to be, I'm not playing fair. Just my impression. Thank you.
Quite welcome. It's absolutely duly noted. There's a great discussion on that. So, Representative Zero, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Sharon, as well. Just staying with the PPP, because I do agree with my colleague, Leader Filippi. Do we know how many businesses took out these loans, and how many were 150,000 less, and how many were over that?
Thousands. And honestly, I'm not prepared to give you all the data on that at this hearing.
okay.
I'm happy to make that available to you when you have your hearing or even before that. But thousands and thousands. I think I read, and I think this would now apply to something like 2,500
reason
businesses, because most of them are small.
Yeah,
And the
and that's-
$150,000 deduction, that threshold knocks out many, many people.
And that's my concern with it being retroactive, because if somebody, say, applied for a $155,000 loan, forgivable grant, they probably would have applied for $149,000, knowing if they were going to be taxed on it, right?
It's the first 150, I believe, not a cliff.
Okay, so it's not a cliff, okay. Well, I look forward to the Article 2 hearing
Yes,
on
we'll,
that.
we'll absolutely provide you with all of these important salient points about the proposal. Really, we were just trying to put it out there.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a high level of interest in this, and we'll make sure we have all the data. And to Representative Amore's point, yes, the governor's executive summary indicates a desire to reverse the decoupling. In fact, the article itself has a provision in it that would allow the tax administrator to reverse the law.
Good.
But we haven't seen anything more formal on that, so I don't want to speak for.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we move on, and we will after this question, Rep. Bella Wilkinson has a question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Sharon. It's great to be back and hearing your briefings again. I have a question with regards to revenue changes, and it has to do with the Rhode Island Department of Veterans Affairs. So as of February of this year, 17 residents were refunded $2,537,187, and 36 veterans are remaining for refunds, and they represent those veterans who are either deceased or have been discharged from the veterans home. So I'd like to know where that money is reflected here, and if it's reflected.
So where it was reflected is when we had a hearing on the closing several months ago, about $5 million or so was held back and booked as a payable. So you're not going to see this because it's already been set aside.
All right. All right, thank
It's-
you.
Checks are being drawn against that, if you will, against that payable. It's not factoring into these things. It's already accounted for.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. You can proceed on to the next portion of it, please.
So I'm also now going to move on to items that are often a big part of these budget solutions. They deal with Medicaid and EOHHS agencies, kind of a catch-all for a lot of your human service, long-term care, managed care, items related to Buddha, DHS, and DCYF. So there's the biggest piece of all of this is a proposal around the hospital license fee, increasing the current rate from 5% to 6%. 6% had been the rate years ago. A couple years ago, you lowered that, and what the budget proposes to do is to raise it in both years above expected amounts. Technically, it also has to set the rate for 22, but when we do our deficit estimates, we kind of think about the prior year as the base. So that item is the largest of the changes. The other changes are relatively small dollar amounts and involve investments and savings on on long-term care. But I can go through a couple of those items with you. The home stabilization, that's when you see a negative, it means it's a new payment, kind of, because we always talk about the budget solve. So on the hospitals, there's the license fee, and then a couple of other programs are reduced, and that produces nearly $60 million of the so-called solve. And you can see the total on this list is only about $60 million. So there's some adds and subtracts. There's savings from redesigning long-term care, enhancing some home-based settings in order to reduce the facility-based settings. On the Eleanor Slater Hospital issue, which we've had, I feel like about a dozen hearings on so far, but now in this budget before you, there's a proposal to do the reorganization effectively as they'd presented to you in the past. It works out to be roughly around $50 million against if nothing is done and you continue to pay. You remember that a component of the enacted budget was that the state would get a approval from the federal government to do a Medicaid match on a different kind of service. They were calling that the state plan amendment or the SPA, and your 21 budget assumed about 10 million from that. Then when we came to you in the second quarter, we said, oh, that's only going to make about 7 million now. What we noticed is the governor's budget didn't assume any of that was available in 22, but kept the 7 million in 21. Today we learned that the SPA was indeed approved, so at least that savings in 21 will be realized, which you were expecting it to. And then, we'll have to see how it factors into the proposal that you're going to be looking at as the weeks go on. But ultimately, there's a savings from transferring patients to alternate settings. There's also parts of the budget that talk about increasing rates in other settings for certain types of patients, which appears to be linked to this, although there's no dollar amount attached to it. So we just put it there for information purposes. Also, with respect to the same department, the Developmental Disabilities Services, there is a $15 million transition fund to start working through some reforms to comply with the consent decree regarding community-based placements and work opportunities. And there's a renewed proposal to privatize the RICLAS system, which is the state-staffed, smaller of the two, but run group homes. So that produces a savings of about 8.1 million. And that are the major changes for Buda. DHS has a bunch of changes that don't affect general revenues, but are high interest items and taking advantage of some of the enhanced federal funds that have flowed to the state, child care reimbursement rates, expansions on Rhode Island Works, as well as child care coverage expansions, a doubling of the community food bank grant, as well as funding with general revenues, the RI serves services through the Veterans Office. In DCYF, there's a proposal to enhance hiring in order to reduce congregate care placements. There's savings on a continued downsizing of the training school and some other initiatives, hiring staff to help manage utilization and working on finding families for placements. There's a proposal to rent out its headquarters to another entity. Since it's savings, I assume it's not a state entity, but we're still looking at that. And then some funding in the event that DCYF isn't able to come into immediate compliance with some new federal rules in order to maintain its match. Moving on to education and local aid, the governor's budget adds about $40 million from general revenues for education aid. This is more than we originally thought would be needed when we looked at the current service. It's about $8 million more, mostly on the direct aid side, with a little bit of savings on teacher retirement and expectations for school construction, which is really tied to project activity. On the education aid piece, the base aid, the governor's out-year estimate assumes 1.4 million in annual increases, which is relatively low. The current recommendation is for 3.7%, and that estimate assumes that increased costs will be offset by population declines. Now, for comparison, the prior year estimates were only about 2%, and as I said, your current recommendation is nearly double that. It is based on, as we'll see, it is based on last year's enrollment, which often happens when you get the budget. March data will be collected and updated and available to you in April, as it typically is. In the past several years, it's required you to add funding. It's unlikely that will be the case this year. And just as a note, this is the 11th year of the funding formula, so all of the phase-ins are long over, and so changes in distributions to communities rely on the factors that go into the funding formula itself: enrollment, poverty counts, community, wealth, et cetera, and the updates to the core instruction funding. A little plug for our second book, which has a extended treatment of the education aid proposal, as well as several tables telling you how it's calculated, and information by community, by charter school, comparisons to prior years, everything you ever wanted to know, I hope. And then, as I mentioned, the other items, teacher retirements fully funded. There's federal funds in there, and I wanted to note this. We think we talked about it in February. There's new one-time federal funds that was made available to every state's governors to use at their discretion as part of the CARES Act. It's known as the Governor's Education something gear, they call it. So one of the components of Governor Raimondo's decision on how to use this, which came out in January, was to use $2.5 million to expand classrooms for pre-K. I will just say this is one-time money, and you don't have anything in the out-year estimates that accounts for backfilling that with other sources. School construction aid remains at $80 million, meeting its obligations of the annual expenses, as well as allowing for some money in the School Building Authority Fund. These costs will go up as we've been projecting with that changes that you adopted a couple years ago, allowing for the bond and the triggered, the temporary incentives that triggered to allow for projects to be done quickly and an incentive really to get them done. The current out-year forecast is the cost of this will go up to about $93 million and continue to grow past that 80 or so. And that's if there's a new bond passed in 2022 to make a total of $500 million on the bond side plus all the amount you're paying over time out of this program. These things are subject to significant revision, and as always, these new federal funds are going to layer into the conversation here, there, and everywhere. In particular, you're aware that allowable uses of older funds as well as some of the new ones involve construction, things to make facilities better, so we're still in the early stages of knowing exactly how that might factor into any of these state spending items. And so we thought this would be a good time to kind of mention all the money that's out there, has come and is coming on education. I mentioned the Governor's Fund. That's up, it increased in both the December Act as well as the American Rescue Plan. K-12 funding available over a number of years is extraordinarily higher than the original money you saw in the CARES Act. And then there's also higher education funds. We don't have exact allocations for that yet. We continue to update that, and as I said, we'll keep you updated. But and we'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation, but there is much more money. There's a lot of rules on maintenance of effort, different levels of maintenance of effort, but there's always a provision that the state or the local, we're not exactly sure who does the application for all of the money in terms of the waiver, but you can apply for a waiver of some of these requirements. If the state wants to do that, I don't know how difficult it is. It certainly would give you some flexibility in budget decisions when you consider how maintenance of proportionality of spending is factored into this. And local communities will have their own maintenance of effort on per pupil spending, particularly in certain low-income areas. There's a maintenance of equity provision. There are a lot of rules around this. So we're still we don't have all the guidance. We're not able to give you probably everything you want to know about this, but it's coming, and the federal Department of Ed is pushing to get this money out. So we're hoping that also comes with the requisite information about making sure that when the state provides it to locals, it's going to be able to follow all the rules attached to it. On the non-education local aid side, the typical programs are funded here, and that's shown in this table. Distressed communities essentially flat with prior years. What's missing from these numbers is that $25 million enhancement that was provided with the 21 budget, but essentially items are level funded, and motor vehicle is consistent with current law. And this slide is an error. I will Sorry, I have to delete that, but no, no, it's not an error. I'm reading it wrong. As I was saying, the pilot money is the same as the prior year. It doesn't have that enhancement. Motor vehicle, 29 million more to go to the next level in current law, which is right about where we thought it would be, maybe less than $1 million difference in terms of the cost of that. In terms of the federal funds to state and local entities, I'm going to mention it here and we'll talk about it again, but on the local side, the state money is probably the normal state aid programs are probably the least of what locals are interested in right now, because there's about over $500 million in the last act that's going to go to locals. It will be allocated, as cities and towns are aware, like the Community Development Block Grant Fund, which means some money goes through the state, but a lot of it goes directly to the biggest cities and towns. So it's going to be interesting how it flows through the state budget. Not all of it will flow through, but we'll always try and keep you apprised of what we're aware of on this. It is absolutely more flexible than the CRF money in that there are provisions for revenue replacement, both on the state and local side. There's a host of allowable uses. It talks about, obviously directly responding to the emergency and the effects, whether it's help for businesses, citizens, et cetera. The limitations just include you can't enact a tax reduction, a new one, and you can't deposit the money into a pension fund. But there's a pretty wide range of uses for those funds. Just in case you're wondering if your community is one of those that gets it directly or goes through the state, if you're not listed here, you go through the state. But we'll provide you as we get it. It's kind of more community by community information, but I figured it was a high interest item. We split it over 2 years because the law provides that the money be given in 2 pieces. And so if you get it this year, you have to wait another year to get the rest, and that's what we expect will happen before the close of fiscal 21. People will get their money, which means they can't get the other half until 22. There is a longer lead time for spending it. I believe it goes out to effectively our fiscal 25, so there's an opportunity to spread the impact over a longer period of time. But that's just a snapshot, really, for a future discussion on what we know about that. Moving on to commerce, you're by now familiar with the more than dozen programs that were adopted over the past several years and changes made over the prior 5 sessions. The funding looks to be about all in maybe $6 million less than we had scored on our deficit calculation, mostly around how much was allocated to keep pre-funding commitments under rebuild that have already been made. There's also the capturing of the dedicated revenue. This isn't really an appropriation, it's on the revenue side, but it's appropriate to talk about here. Some dedicated revenue sources for the Pawtucket redevelopment project is reflected in this budget. Your 21 enacted budget included the authority to make sure that transfer could happen. This has the a dollar amount revisions for the current year as well as next year. In terms of the current programs, the 22 budget keeps some of the more ongoing programs going. There's a there's a recapitalization of the Small Business Assistance Fund, Rebuild Rhode Island, another $22.5 million payment into the fund for tax credits that have been committed already. The governor has proposed expanding the availability of those tax credits, dollar amount and length of time. But the money here is really paying for money that's already been committed. Pass-through expenditures are the same as prior years. I would note another item of interest is you had appropriation language in 21 regarding urban ventures as your minority business item. That is not in this budget. The money is there, but not the identification of the recipient. Also, on the commerce end, there's a repeat of the housing reorganization proposal the governor had last year that, as part of your current service budget, you didn't enact any of those changes. And also a housing fund proposal. similar to last year, but a little bit different in that this applies only to residential properties on that extra real estate conveyance tax tier and at a higher level above 700,000. It also takes a portion of the state's general revenues and dedicates it to this fund. And then I would just remind you, there's the newly approved $65 million in bonds that were approved by the voters in March. Also, now talking about the federal assistance, there is a lot of money for housing and rental assistance in the past two federal funds. Some of which it's a lot relative for Rhode Island because it's at the small state minimum. So $200 million in rental assistance from the December stimulus, another $150 million in the rescue plan. Just a couple months later, these funds have not been given out yet. I know Rhode Island Housing is working on getting their application process and their website up to start giving this money out. There's utility assistance. There's a host of possible uses. There's also in the rescue plan some homeowner assistance. There is just a lot of money available. And so you'll be hearing more about, how that can be used, how that is being used, and then how that may affect some of your other budget decisions and ideas about other funding. We talked about kind of the big solves, and then the rest of it's all kind of happening in all the departments and agencies, and there are some statewide items. As I mentioned, there's the cost shifts. I already kind of went through that, the RICAP delay. Governor basically takes the $90 million that you budgeted for 2021 and shifts it out, gives an extra year. That 2-year change accounts for $70 million of the budget solve, which is a big number. Another $70 million comes from applying freed up coronavirus relief funds that we had thought was going to expire and we thought was all committed on to personnel. So that is another $70 million. One of the reasons you have that much available is because of the change we talked about in February on the state having to make a contribution for the FEMA expenses. So the state had been planning to use its CRF money to cover the 25% match. With the federal government waiving that match, all that CRF money became available for other uses. So in this budget, it's being used to help offset the shortfall in 22 by creating the 21 surplus. The December stimulus extended the ability to use these funds another year. So you were up against a deadline just a few months ago. That deadline got extended. In addition to the deadline getting extended, a decision on the FEMA money made a whole bunch more available that you didn't realize was no longer needed for the item it was allocated for. And then, of course, things change about how much really got spent. Additionally, in your 21 budget, you budgeted about $106 million of general revenues for COVID response because you didn't have another source to pay for it 2 stimuluses ago. And so you budgeted that. This budget flips that back to federal funds. So that creates $91 million in savings. So you put these items together, you get over $230 million of cost shifts, whether by fund source or by timing, that helps create that big 21 surplus to solve 22. I realize that's a lot to think about, but that's why we talk about it as kind of a 2-year solution. And at the end of the day, it's mostly federal funds, helping you solve your budget crisis. There's also some other items of interest that don't involve federal funds. The governor's proposed $3 million more from general revenues for real jobs. You're familiar with that program. There's a little more money for crime victims compensation. You probably heard about some shortfalls in that program. There's additional money for new staff, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, some testing money to backfill a delay that happened in testing and some lost federal funds there. The Promise program is funded. You extended it, and it would be funded anyway in '22, but the governor also proposes to make it permanent. There are several initiatives around the Department of Corrections, employment activities, probation and parole reform, behavioral health care initiatives, medication-assisted treatment expansion. So a lot of those smaller items, but high-interest items, some of which are attached to budget articles, some are not, law changes. So there's savings from those. There's some spending on those. We mentioned this last time about transportation getting more money through the December stimulus. So I'm kind of just revisiting that here and now talking about what the governor's budget does around transportation money. And so if you remember, the Consolidated Act gave additional money for DOT and then provided money above that for unmatched, money that didn't need match. The voters approved the $72 million in bonds that you put out there on the idea that gas tax revenues were down. You had used your rainy day fund, so there was less available in RICAP. So you were using that money to help DOT meet their match and some newer projects they needed match for. So the governor actually adds $53.5 million on top of all of that over FY22 and 23. And also his capital budget assumes that additional legislation to borrow more money through revenue bonds would be available, that next year the Assembly approves that for another $35 million. So there's a lot of transportation spending. I don't want to say seventh stimulus, but there is an infrastructure bill being discussed, so I'm sure we'll also be talking about that if something comes to fruition there. But transportation, there's a lot of funding in the budget as well as federal sources newly approved for that. Also, the budget does use the available resources from the Opioid Stewardship Fund, which comes out to be about $5 million annually. A piece of the governor's use of it does offset general revenues. The 21 budget didn't use every penny of it, so some of that carried forward to 22. And you can see the uses here. The Department of Health spending is the lab and the needle exchange money. That's what's being swapped for general revenues there. So some of that savings contributes to the budget solved by swapping it out for general revenues. So that is the wide overview of the budget solve by major item. And again, we have lists within here of things that you probably care about, and certainly ask me about them as we go through it. Big picture, it's a $11.2 billion budget, $4.4 billion of it coming from general revenues. You can see the major reduction in federal funds from the budget you adopted in 21. That's going to change as you now have received more money, and we'll pass that through the budget in some form, maybe not all of it, but most of that has to do with unemployment changes, as the uptick had to do with the unemployment benefit spending, as well as the change here has to do with that. Salaries and benefits overall are about 2% less than the enacted budget. Between fund sources, it's very difficult to track because a lot of spending was put on federal funds, but there is additional funding in there for related to the voluntary retirement incentive with some offsetting savings. You've heard about this program. It's similar to what was done in 2008, where the administration offered employees who were eligible to retire by the end of the calendar year an incentive to do so. It's not an impact on one's retirement, just incentivizing them to leave state service. The incentive is linked to the employee's longevity payment, doubling that value and capping it at $40,000. The idea before, and presumably the idea now, is that if you refill a position with someone who has no state service, it will cost you less. So the net savings proposed in the budget assumes that all positions are refilled, but they are refilled assuming no longevity. Whether or not they're all refilled, or whether they're refilled at that lower rate to that degree, that will remain to be seen. That savings, of course, is net of the payouts that are made. We put a little table here from what we got from the administration on how they came to it. The state has a fund that it deposits assessments on all of its spending to cover when somebody leaves state service and has unused vacation time, or when we have to pay unemployment. So that fund pays for all of that. So that fund will take a hit with these extra payouts, which will be recaptured over time. But overall, the state has less money budgeted, has an overall savings of $6 million from the initiative here. And just a reminder, 14,000 people, full-time equivalent positions in state government, about 13.8 as of the last filled FTE report. Always less than the limits set in the budget for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is turnover or forced turnover. But this budget does have 130 new positions. There's big changes in Buda. The privatization of ride class would be a loss of 50, and Eleanor Slater Hospital reorg envisions a loss of 100. There's new state troopers and a full 25 add to the FTE count for them. There's 20 FTEs added around the adult marijuana program. There's new frontline staff for DCYF I mentioned earlier. Additional staffing at DOC, DEM, and the Department of Health. By category, again, we talked about the different categories of expenses. You can see that assistance, grants, and benefits line is the one that goes down the most, and a lot of that is driven by the flow of unemployment benefits through the state budget. So we typically like to show you changes year to year, and you can see that just the comparisons are very complicated given all of this unusual money flowing through the budget. And again, that's likely to change as we try to, add the stimulus spending into the budget. There have been 6 acts, as we talked about. We've listed them here, the latest being this American Rescue Plan. I've talked a lot about it already tonight, but I've got some of our older slides, which we've showed you before, to remind you of all of the money that has flowed through the state and to your constituents, Rhode Island businesses, citizens. The last 2 being the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which contained that direct stimulus payments as well as funding for vaccines, schools, businesses, the rental assistance I mentioned. I mentioned the education and the MOE items earlier, and that money from that act is actually available through Fiscal 23. So a lot of these things, unlike the CRF, which was an emergency response, it needed to be used right away on emergency items. Much of this has a longer life and allows you to make different decisions about its use and have it last longer. You're not in a rush to spend all of it. There's certainly urgency to spending some of it, I imagine, but the life on the funds is longer. I mentioned the governor's flexible funding being used to expand pre-K. The rest of it is listed here, and I believe we talked about that in February as well. Student mental health access, some assistance for adults at CCRI, similar to the way Promise is run. This is finite funding. These are finite programs. I mentioned that the CRF fund use was extended for a year. And back in February, we told you that most of it appeared to be committed, but it was hard to know. And as time goes on, we learn more about what's been spent, and as the rules change, of course, we get more information. So I'm going to show you what was in the enacted budget for personnel funded from this, $149 million. As I mentioned, the governor's budget puts another $70 million on that. That's a direct relief for general revenues. Over the 2 years, 343 million is used for personnel. So that has been a big help in covering your budget gaps. This table was actually provided in the governor's executive summary and is a helpful snapshot of over the 3 years where a lot of the federal funds are coming from and for the COVID response, and where a lot of the source for the spending for the COVID response is coming from. You can see most of it is from some kind of federal source, primarily CRF and FEMA, and then those dozens of other grants that flow through the state budget. On the general revenue side, there's still a component of funding for general revenues left over. I mentioned that you had about 106 million in the enacted, about 90 came out. This is what's left. In terms of where the full CRF went over those years, this table summarizes that for you. You have the programs you already knew about, local aid, housing, the business supports. I would just have an asterisk there on the business supports because there is a $30 million new program in the governor's budget that we don't have too much on yet, so we'll report that to you when we know more about it, but that's been earmarked for a new business support program. As I mentioned, there was the expectation that you would have to spend about 106 million of state money in addition to available FEMA and other federal grants. That's obviously changed now. We told you in February they were probably going to be covered by new funds, and indeed, like I said, the governor's budget includes only about 14 million of general revenues for these items, again contributing to the budget solve. I've talked a little about the rescue plan as we've been going along, and I talked about the local share of the money. There was also the stimulus checks to individuals, unemployment benefit extension. In terms of the recovery funds to Rhode Island, $1.1 billion, this is the same item from the local section, but I'll focus a little on the state piece. That money is more flexible. There's a provision for revenue replacement. The exact measurement of that and the benchmarks used for that, I think still kind of subject to the guidance and interpretation, but it does allow for more flexible use of this funding and over a longer period of time. The other important thing is as I noted before, the Act contains money for a host of other programs that have always flowed through the state budget, either through all federal funds or a combination of state and federal. Child care being one, LIHEAP, Head Start, congregate meals for the elderly. Clearly, there's direct support for testing and those items, but there's also enhanced support for mental health and other behavioral health issues. So there are just a lot of new programs or newly available funds through old programs to kind of get a handle on how that's going to go through, how that's going to affect spending and programs that you can fund. And just a reminder that even with all the funds that you have, the kind of spending by function is still pretty similar, that you do spend more than a third of your budget, all funds on human service programs, and almost a third on education. When you strip it down to general revenues, education and human services each represent a little over a third. So that's not really changed in this budget. And the last thing, the last operating budget thing I want to talk about is our usual discussion of long-term growth rates. We've updated this information for you on what the out-year forecast assumes. I also like to remind you what the all your sources of funds are, which ones are flexible and which aren't. Obviously, general revenues, personal income and sales are your most flexible fund sources. The capital budget is part of the governor's budget submission. We also published for you a summary of that. I I've got some slides on that. I'm just going to pick off a couple of things to let you know about. You know about RICAP. We talked about how taking that money from the rainy day fund interrupted the flow of resources, which is why you see that 21 number being so low in that blue graph. So the payback into the fund, spreading it out over 3 years, you're not going to see that similar spike. But that is budgeted for, as I mentioned. You had budgeted over 2 years, it's budgeted over 3 years, and then the capital budget accounts for that in the spending. There's no new general obligation bonds to approve in this budget, but there are other debt approvals that will come before you in the coming weeks. 2 of them you've seen before. They deal with the Memorial Union and the Health Center project at URI, where they're looking for an increased ability to borrow. There's the child welfare IT system, which you heard, it's essentially the same project as last year that did not get approved. And then there is a major change to the prior approval on debt for the Eleanor Slater Hospital restructuring and the building of a new facility on Zambarano, essentially taking a prior debt approval, dedicating only half of that to the old plan of fixing ligature risks at Reagan, and then dedicating the other half to Zambarano and doing a new debt for another $53 million, all told the $65 million for a new long-term care facility out in Burrillville. So those will come before you as separate items to review in committee. We've updated some information for you on the overall debt structure, and we will always talk about that as you consider new items. As I mentioned earlier, the second school construction bond is factored into the governor's budget, out-year projections, as well as in the capital budget. The only other new GO bond noted in the capital budget is the $35 million for the state police barracks. The prior governor didn't always show future bonds. Prior to that, a whole bunch of future bonds were shown there. So this is kind of halfway, I guess, with the 250 and then the state police. But experience shows that over time, new projects get added, and so these values are probably understated. And then again, as with everything, the federal stimulus funds availability for capital projects may influence some of the decisions you make around these projects. Your net tax supported debt service is here. You see it declines over time, but again, that will be affected by projects getting added. As I started to talk about the out years, the budget as submitted has out year deficits exceeding $350 million annually. That is, I would say, probably at this point a placeholder for the many different changes that are likely to occur. But it does give you a sense of what it means when you use one-time resources to solve budget problems. You do end up with a fairly structurally imbalanced budget. The annual expenditures the state's expecting to have under all other circumstances being equal will still outpace the projected revenues. And again, as you make decisions on how to use the stimulus funds, those things will change, but always keep in mind that commitments for long-term spending, if they outrun the money, you have to kind of think about the couple different ways that's going to flow through your budget. And here's the actual table I wanted to show you. The earlier one was incorrect, so I apologize for that. If you look at your total revenues, those are projected over the next 4 years to grow by about 2.3%, your expenditures by about 2.5%. A little bit less of a disconnect as in prior years, but given that you had that you still have that sort of big use of one-time funds, and then you still have a disconnect on revenues and expenditures, you're looking at an out-year structural deficit. As I said before, the staff is going to continue to analyze this budget as well as the federal legislation. As I mentioned, there's dozens of major programs that have infusions of cash, and those will change some of the discussions you're having. Obviously, major decisions are facing policymakers on coordinating the use of these funds, because you have things with different timelines, things are more flexible, and it will be difficult but important to both meet the federal rules to ensure they're used properly, but also to maximize the impact to the state over the next several years, knowing all of these items are in play. So I'm happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that presentation. Look like we do have some questions lined up. I just want to remind our panel members and people who are watching, this is a briefing. We're going to have several of these. Also, there will be a number of subcommittee meetings as we go through this process, where we have subcommittee chairs who will dig deep into the numbers as we go forward. So this was just an overall briefing, but it gives us a scope of work that we are getting ready for. So I'm just trying to see who had their hands up first. He actually did. Rep. Barrows has his hand up. Then we'll go to Rep. Ella Wilkinson. We'll go to Rep. Giro, and yeah, we'll keep in that line. Rep. Barrows.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Sharon, for a wonderful presentation. Mine is a pretty quick question. So, with all the funds, all the grants that we've gotten from the federal government, is that included in the budget for 11 point whatever billion dollars, or no?
Only to the extent we knew about them before the governor submitted his budget, and even, quite honestly, I think there are funds in the December stimulus that probably are not reflected here, because I think it was Representative Slater who mentioned that guidance tends to lag the enactment of something to the extent that some grants are competitive, so you may not even know they're coming. If they're formula grants, you might know, but maybe you don't have a plan to spend them, so you haven't spread it out in your budget how it's going to go. So definitely not. It's just the extent to which things other than the ARP are in there. There are some things probably missing from even the prior stimulus.
So the 1.7 billion the state is getting, is that included in that? Okay.
No, so you're referring to the 1.1 and the
Correct.
6. None of that is in here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon, if I could ask you to take a look at slide 64, which is staffing changes. I was under the impression that in September, CCRI had issued about 45 staff layoffs, and so I was wondering why it wasn't listed here, or if that's someplace else within the presentation I just missed.
So one of the things that's always confusing is that your FTEs that are listed in Article 1 of the budget are a limit, not necessarily everybody who's employed. Many agencies, actually, I can show you, there's 1,300 authorized FTEs, budgetarily authorized, at least for the position, maybe not the money, that are not filled. So if an agency undertook layoffs and reduced its overall staffing complement and then brought them back or whatever, and there was no change to the maximum FTE cap for the state, you would not see that on this list. Because I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about the secondary cap on hiring. So hiring is constrained by both the money that's available to an agency as well as this outside cap.
So if the 45 staff members from CCRI were brought back, would that be considered a furlough as opposed to a layoff?
I wouldn't be able to say because I'm not sure what the distinction is for the purpose of the employee. What I can just tell you is that the state did not lower CCRI's FTE cap when those positions were eliminated, and this budget does not increase it to accommodate new positions. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does from an HR point of view. I'm just trying to figure out from the time that they were laid off, which I was notified in September, and I think that some of them are still considered laid off. Where's that money? Because they're not expending it on labor costs. So is the organization absorbing it at some of the line item? Or can we find out?
So, yeah, so what I would say is it's important to distinguish a cap on counting full-time equivalent positions from the money that's used to pay for them. So in the case of the state colleges and universities, their fund sources include state money as well as tuition and fees and other sources. When they determine that that money is going down and they react to that by reducing staff, that's how they cut their expenses to meet their available revenues, state general revenues only being a component of that. All of it's included in, like all the money they expect to spend might be included in the budget, but if that money doesn't actually come to them, they can't spend it and they can't hire people or keep people on staff to pay for it.
A final question, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman. So then, I understand, I'm following you all the way through. The only question that I have now is, if they were indeed laid off, they would have had, some of them would have at least had an ability to collect benefits. So what pot of money would that come from with the unemployment?
So it's interesting because one of the first provisions, one of the first or second stimulus had a provision that said that when nonprofits or state governments effectively have to have people go unemployed, they typically, under normal circumstances, it's a reimbursement basis, so they don't pay into the fund. But if they have an incidence of someone getting laid off, they just get billed for that cost, and that is paid through the states. Got a fund for that. That's that assessed fringe fund. Actually, it's one of the many things that the state has a way to pay for. When the federal government passed some of the early stimulus acts, it actually said we'll also pay for half of that. You may even remember that the job sharing, they decided they'd pay for 100% of that. So the unemployment benefits associated with those layoffs were picked up to a great degree by the federal government.
Including those fraudulent claims that were placed?
So fraudulent claims, separating fraudulent claims from fraudulent payments, I think DLT is still trying to sort through exactly where that hits the bottom line, but always remember that for unemployment purposes, there's a trust fund funded by employers, and in the case of the federal funds that are supporting the extraordinarily high unemployment rates and the extended benefits, that's money drawn from the federal government. What we don't know is, when all the fraud is sorted out, is there a bill to pay either through the fund or through some other source?
All right. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Chairman.
You are quite welcome, Reverend Giroux.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Sharon. So it seems like there are some restrictions with this money. You can't use it for taxes or the pension, but there seems to be some flexibility. When I read your budget at a first glance, and I have not yet read the bestseller budget at a second glance yet, but I did notice that the COVID relief vaccines, the budget includes $60 million over 21 and 22, and this is before the $1.8 billion in federal dollars. Do we as a state have the flexibility to use federal funds for that and for the vaccines, and then maybe swap out the $60 million for elsewhere in the budget?
That's what the budget does.
Okay. So there is some flexibility. I guess my other question on slide 46, when you talked about the housing, $200 million for rental assistance, $150 million for utility assistance, and then homeowner assistance. Is there any flexibility for that to go over 3 to 4 years, or does all this money have to be spent within this particular budget cycle?
So the first piece of it from the December stimulus has a faster life to it, but I believe, if my information is right, the second piece you have until 2027. But the first piece, there's actually a rush to get some of that money out because there's a recapture provision from the federal government. If you are not using it and you're not getting it out to people who need it, they will take it back.
That was my next question.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes.
So we have to be really, really mindful of the deadlines and really buttoned up as to use it in a timely fashion or we lose it. but there is some ability to spread it out till 2027.
So really, think about it, even though it's all for a similar purpose, that first piece, actually, my recollection, though, is that the second act extended the use of the first act money as well.
Oh, my.
So
Okay.
it honestly, you do, it's very difficult to keep track of, but yes, that was one of the problems is, what I don't know is when the recapture, if that also got delayed. But the bottom line is, at least on the first piece, the idea is get the money out to people who need it as quickly as you can. The other money might have a longer life to it, and
Well, I'm glad you're in charge of the scorecard, keeping track of it. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
Absolutely, Rep. Diaz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon, it's a lot to process today. And as you mentioned before, we will have an opportunity to dissorting it, every single aspect, maybe by agencies, and also the opportunity to speak with the department directors to ask questions directly. In order to be ready, I wanted you help me to clarify something in this presentation, and it's in relation to slide 28. And when you get the slide 28, also be ready for 64, because I'm trying to make a correlation between the two. As you remember, my good colleague Camila Bella Wilkinson, we talked and asked a lot of questions about right class, how the privatization will be affecting the FTE that work for that department. As it's included there, can you help me to understand the relation between the privatization for right class, about the $11 million, 11.7, with the staffing changes and saving in slide 64? Do you see it's right class 50? It's referring to the FTE that was not eliminated, but privatized to get it out. Now the question is, that affect the patients? There was just only for the FTE, right?
so the way to think about this is, in this case, the earlier slide talked about the money, right? Your budget includes X amount of dollars to pay for people who fill FTEs. If those FTEs are empty, you could leave the FTEs available to fill someday if you ever got money. This budget takes the money and takes the FTEs. Sometimes if people, in the case as we were discussing with the colleges, if they experience a revenue shortfall and are unable to fill or keep their positions filled and those positions become empty, you could take the FTEs to go with the fact that the money left, or you could leave it there in the event they get more money and are able to fill them. So they are connected, but not, one does not have to follow the other.
Okay, I appreciate a lot. So the point here is that the 50 FTEs value to or saving is the $11.7 million that is in the first slide. That would be the way to interpret it.
Effectively, yes, because remember that whenever these things are proposed, there's a little bit of time lag. It takes time to implement, but effectively that's the idea, is that I believe there's 100 currently assigned, 200, excuse me. There's currently 200 FTEs assigned to this, so what you're seeing on the money side is the transfer of these resources to a private provider.
Yes.
Okay? And then,
But when they transfer to private providers, disappear from the budget of the state agency.
Correct.
Because, yes.
yep.
Okay.
Essentially, this is the beginning of the process, so you don't see.
Yeah.
A difference would be last year when all 200 were taken.
Yeah.
But the money is not that different. So it's just a choice about how to reflect it. The more
Okay.
important thing in this case is the money piece.
Yeah. Thank you. Clarify most of my concerns. And now, can you please move to slide 32? As this slide shows, for education aid, in line 4 is $10.9 million more for direct aid to schools. Do you have or can help me to understand what we be specifically the aid for that? Because we are in the middle of conversation between traditional school and non. So I want to have a clear idea if that can help in some way the situation.
So just, I think you were probably not present when I talked about where we have all
I'm
of that.
sorry.
That's okay. In this second book we gave out, there is item by item, every school who gets what.
Okay.
But it's all pursuant to the formula. So if you're looking for something to change the formula, this doesn't do that.
Okay.
So, but where it all is we do have that in this document.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon. I think I have more questions. Maybe we give a break to the chairman and be quiet, but maybe I ask you again. Thank you, Sharon.
She won't give you a break, Sharon. She'll be there. I know that. That's good. We have Rep. Quarchochi. I see him waving. How you doing, young man? You got a question, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. Go ahead.
Yep. Hi, Sharon. Forgive me if I missed this, if you mentioned this and I missed it, but the folks that were hired by the Department of Health to, I'll be nice and say, monitor our restaurants and our businesses for COVID regulation compliance, are they funded by federal relief money?
I believe that almost all of those expenses are currently covered through federal funds. As I mentioned earlier, not specific to this, but the only general revenues left for COVID response from your 21 budget is $14 million for the whole state, with most of that having to do with the surge hospitals, some of it on business, but most of your contact tracing, there's no general revenues on that, best I can tell. And that's the place where the state has gotten some of the most federal relief from a variety of sources.
Right. Do we have any idea how many were hired?
I can get that for you because it was a combination of contract folks as well as FTEs. We'll have to...
Yeah, I guess my concern is that they will become permanent members of our FTEs.
So
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say is that what you may remember from the 21 budget is that you did provide a little bit of wiggle room on the FTE cap for the Department of Health because they had done so much hiring that their other programs, vacancies in their other programs had to be used. But the idea is that that if there's no money for the positions, the positions follow the money, if you will, when it dries up.
Thank you. And my other question, you mentioned revenue bonds potentially for transportation spending.
Yes. You remember last year's budget proposal to issue, I don't know, it was about $64 million of revenue bonds against related to the old Garvey. It wasn't approved, and it looks like the governor's capital budget assumes asking the 2019 next year's assembly to approve that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if maybe you can give everybody a sense of what types of revenues would be available to pay back.
So in that particular case, it's tied to 2 cents on the gas tax, and it's really an extension of a prior mechanism used in the early 2000s.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your questions. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I know that to my left, Rep. Diaz still has a burning question that she wants to to ask, so she's giving me a break tonight. No, I understand, but I want everybody to, over a period of time, make sure you understand it as best as possible, and it's accumulative as we go. We all will, but I never like to leave a question hanging because it's just so important. Okay, if there are no further questions from any of the members on the panel and no further questions from any of our guests, other members who are on my screen, then I think that should end the business of the Finance Committee tonight. Thank you all very much. Thank you.